Hey everybody, Maverick Christian here. Between 2020 and 2021, Cameron Bertuzzi, Caption Christianity, and Stephen Woodford of Rationality Rules debated the kalam cosmological argument. The debate included an interesting illustration not only of the red herring fallacy, but another type of fallacy I haven't yet discussed in my vlog series, the Motte fallacy. In part 1, I'll describe some informal logic where, among other things, I'll explain the Motte fallacy. In part 2, I'll explain some of Cameron Bertuzzi's arguments in the debate and give some commentary, including objections of my own. In part 3, I'll comment on 3 objections Stephen Woodford made in his opening statement. In part 4, I'll comment on Woodford's rejoinders to Bertuzzi's replies to the objections that part 3 describes. Here I'll explain why some of Woodford's rejoinders here appear to be Motte and Bailey's. And the last part, of course, will be the conclusion. Part 1. Some informal logic. Some logic lingo. An argument is a series of statements called premises used to support a conclusion. By explicit premises, I mean those clearly stated premises that are listed in the argument. An argument is valid if it's logically impossible to have two premises and a false conclusion. In this vlog episode, when I say an argument is logically valid, I'll be referring to the explicitly stated premises of that argument, such that a logically valid argument is one where it's impossible to have true explicit premises and a false conclusion. 3 informal fallacies that are relevant in this video are the straw man, the red herring, and the Motte and Bailey. The straw man is a mischaracterization of what someone says that's easier to attack than the actual position. When done by accident through erroneous thinking, it becomes a straw man fallacy. A red herring is something that misleads or distracts, and the red herring fallacy, or ignoratio elenchi as it's also called, is the fallacy of supposing a point proved or refuted by establishing something not at issue. I talk more about red herrings in vlog episode 8. The Motte and Bailey castle is a type of structure in the early medieval period comprised of an enclosed courtyard called the bailey and an earthen mound called the motte, which is the site of a more defensible fortification. The Motte and Bailey rhetorical technique is named after the Motte and Bailey castle, and is where the arguer conflates two different positions that share similarities in the following manner. The first position, the bailey, is the initial more controversial claim. The motte is the more defensible claim that the arguer retreats to when the bailey is challenged, in which the arguer claims this more defensible position is what their position was all along, even though it wasn't the original stated position. Just as red herrings can occur unintentionally as an error in reasoning, in which case it's a red herring fallacy, the Motte and Bailey technique can also occur unintentionally as an error in reasoning, in which case it's the Motte and Bailey fallacy. To reiterate, both the red herring and the Motte and Bailey can occur unintentionally as errors in reasoning. We've all made mistakes in our reasoning at some point or another. So whether you're an atheist or religious, if you see someone on the other side employ a straw man or a red herring or Motte and Bailey, consider the possibility they made an honest mistake. Fallacies like the Motte and Bailey are fallacies for a reason. Errors in reasoning like this have occurred. Unfortunately, fallacies have the potential to mislead audiences. How justifying arguments work is that you try to say true stuff to support a claim. But it's possible to say true stuff to support a related but somewhat different claim that gives the illusion of justifying the relevant claim. So red herring fallacies sometimes argue for a point closely related to the actual issue to have a greater chance of hoodwinking the audience. Similarly, a Motte and Bailey fallacy can give the illusion of the motte being the same position as the bailey if they're closely related to each other and the arguer says that they're in the same position. Part 2. Cameron Bertuzzi's arguments. Causal finitism is the view that all causal chains are finite, so everything has a finite causal history. If causal finitism is true, then there is a first cause. Note that the claim that there exists a first cause is not the same thing as saying there is only one first cause, any more than saying there is a lake in Minnesota is the same thing as saying there is only one lake in Minnesota. That may seem too obvious to mention, but that'll be important later on. Another important point that'll be relevant later on is that causal finitism is not the same thing as a finite past. There is no contradiction between causal finitism and an infinite past. For example, imagine a scenario in which the past is infinite, but the first causal event didn't occur until a finite amount of time ago. That is, for an infinite past time nothing happened, and then something popped into being uncaused out of nothing, which began a finite causal chain. Here's a situation with an infinite past but a finite causal chain. Do I think this scenario is metaphysically possible? No, but the point is that causal finitism does not logically entail a finite past. There is no contradiction with causal finitism being true and an infinite past both being the case. Here's Bertuzzi's main argument.
All right, I promised you an updated formulation of the kalam cosmological argument, and here it is. Premise 1, there is a first cause. Premise 2, if there is a first cause, then God exists. And the conclusion follows, God exists.
Bertuzzi's defense of premise 1 involves the Grim Reaper paradox I've discussed before. Here are the conditions of the paradox. Grim Reaper number 1 checks on Fred at midnight plus 1 hour, or 1 a.m., and thus would kill Fred at 1 a.m. if Fred were alive then, taking a half hour to do it. Grim Reaper number 2 checks on Fred at midnight plus half an hour, or 12:30 a.m., and would take 15 minutes to kill Fred if he were alive then. Grim Reaper number 3 checks on Fred at midnight plus 1/4 an hour, or 12:15 a.m. Grim Reaper number 4 checks on Fred at midnight plus 1/8 of an hour, or 12:07 and 30 seconds, and so forth for an infinite number of Grim Reapers, such that there is no first Grim Reaper. Does Fred survive this? He can't survive it since if nothing else, Grim Reaper number 1 would have killed him at 1 a.m. if he were still alive then. And yet, no Grim Reaper could have killed Fred, since any Grim Reaper you point to, say Grim Reaper number 2, there's another Grim Reaper before it that would have killed Fred if he were still alive then. So no Grim Reaper could have killed Fred, and yet Fred must be dead. So this Grim Reaper paradox creates a logical contradiction, and thus this scenario is logically impossible. Bertuzzi tries to use this impossible scenario as evidence for causal finitism.
But think about it. What is impossible about the scenario? It's not impossible that like someone is waiting to kill another person. That's not impossible. That's all the Grim Reapers are really doing in the story. What's impossible about this story, about this scenario, is the infinite set of killers. If we make the total number of Grim Reapers finite, then the contradiction just completely vanishes. And thus, we've arrived at a key claim of causal finitism. Every event or state must have a finite causal history.
The Grim Reaper paradox is an example of something called a supertask, which roughly is something that has an infinite sequence of consecutive events done within a finite time span. In this case, the infinite sequence of events is having a Grim Reaper check on Fred. Bertuzzi then uses this argument.
Premise 4. The Grim Reaper scenario is impossible. And we just discussed why this premise is true. It gives us an explicit contradiction, and contradictions are impossible. Premise 5. If the Grim Reaper scenario is impossible, then causal finitism is true. We just discussed why this is true. What's impossible about the Grim Reaper scenario is the infinite set of killers. Make the series finite, and then the contradiction just vanishes. So it follows causal finitism is true from premises 4 and 5. Premise 7, if causal finitism is true, then there is a first cause. And remember, if every state has a finite causal history, there must be a first cause. So it follows there is a first cause from 6 and premise 7.
Here's my evaluation of the argument. Premise 4 is rationally undeniable since it's clearly logically impossible to have a Grim Reaper paradox. Premise 7 is true since a finite causal history would obviously necessitate at least some first cause. Premise 5 is really the only vulnerable premise, but I thought the justification offered here was somewhat weak. I can see why one would think premise 5 is true. One might think that if you could have an infinite causal history, you could have the Grim Reaper paradox, particularly since there's no contradiction when you limit the Grim Reaper events to be finitely many. And its Grim Reaper is just checking on Fred and killing him if he's alive then. If I put on my atheist hat and think like a critic, I could say that just because the Grim Reaper scenario is impossible, it doesn't mean an infinite history can't happen of causal events. Maybe an infinite causal history just needs to be spread out over an infinite time span instead of a finite one. I could say that the Grim Reaper paradox suggests that supertasks can't happen, that it's metaphysically impossible for time to be infinitely divisible within a finite time span. That doesn't mean infinite past can't happen. Now that might sound a little ad hoc, saying that infinite causal history can happen, but not when the time intervals between causal events get arbitrarily close within a finite time span, but it's an objection one can make nonetheless. Later in the debate, Cameron would provide a better argument using the Grim Messenger paradox, which does generate a logical contradiction over an infinite past. That paradox works like this.
All right, so I want to switch gears a little bit and introduce you to a new version of the Grim Reaper story, something that Dr. Rob Coons calls the Grim Messenger story. One of the primary differences between the Reaper story and the Messenger story is that instead of being split over an hour, the messengers are split over an infinite past. Grim Messenger number 1 is assigned to January 1st, 2020. Messenger number 2 is assigned to January 1st, 2019. Messenger number 3 is assigned to January 1st, 2018, and so on further and further into the past. So instead of killing people, these messengers are tasked basically with passing on a message that they received from their predecessor. They pass that message to their successor. Messenger number 3, for example, receives a message from number 4 and passes it to number 2. So here's the crucial setup for this story. If the message that they receive from their predecessor has no natural number written on it, then they'll go ahead and write their number. So messenger number 3, if it's blank, he'll write the number 3 on it. But on the other hand, if the message that they receive already has a number on it, then they do nothing. They don't write anything down. They just pass the message on to their successor. Again, understanding the setup is really important. So if it wasn't super clear, just pause the video, rewind it, and watch it one more time. Okay, so now our question is, does this message have a natural number written on it? And the obvious answer here is yes. Suppose that no one wrote anything down until the year 2020. Well then, Grimm messenger number 1 would have written the number 1 on it. So there has to be some number written on this message. But here's the sort of paradoxical question that gets asked here is what number is written on the message? The answer, again, paradoxically, is that it can't have any natural number written on it. Suppose for a moment that the number written on this message is 1000. This is actually impossible because Grimm messenger number 1001 would have written 1001 on the paper if when he received it, it was blank. So Grimm messenger number 1000 would have received a paper that said 1001, and he would have just passed the message along. And this same process can be repeated for any Grimm messenger, any natural number. So it follows from this that no natural number can be written on the message. So just like in the Grim Reaper scenario, we have an explicit contradiction. The message has a natural number written on it, and the message has no natural number written on it.
Unfortunately, this doesn't quite work either. I was one of the reviewers, and I should have caught this mistake, so please blame me and not Cameron Bertuzzi. The Grim Messenger scenario, as described here, wouldn't necessarily create a logical contradiction. Consider what Cameron said here.
Suppose for a moment that the number written on this message is 1000. This is actually impossible because Grim messenger number 1001 would have written 1001 on the paper if when he received it, it was blank.
But what if messenger 1001 received the number 1000 from his predecessor, and indeed what if the number 1000 were being carried throughout all eternity through all of the messengers? That wouldn't create a contradiction, nor would it violate any of the requirements Bertuzzi gave in his description in the video. We can fix that though by adding 2 additional requirements. If the messenger's predecessor has a higher assigned natural number, then the messenger writes down their own assigned natural number if and only if the predecessor does not give them a natural number greater than their own assigned natural number. If, for example, messenger number 12 receives number 10 from messenger number 13, messenger number 12 sends the number 12. If, however, number 13 sends the number 1000 to number 12, then number 12 passes it along. If the messenger's predecessor has a lower assigned natural number, or has no predecessor, then the messenger writes down their own assigned natural number if and only if the predecessor does not give them a natural number lesser than their own assigned natural number. If, for example, messenger number 12 receives the number 1000 from messenger number 11, messenger number 12 writes down 12 and passes it along. If, however, messenger 11 gives messenger number 12 the number 1, then messenger number 12 passes it along to the next messenger if there is a next messenger. So given the arrangement times as described here, the first requirement becomes relevant and each messenger writes down their own assigned natural number if and only if they do not receive a natural number greater than their own assigned natural number. And that's true whether the received message is blank, a smaller number, or even if they received no message at all. This would create a contradiction, since in this case, the number 1000 couldn't have been passed through because messenger 1001 would have written down 1001 if they received a natural number less than 1001. This type of thing goes for every other messenger in the Grim Messenger scenario. Cameron then describes the benign messenger scenario that creates no contradiction. It's the same as the Grim Messenger scenario, for example, it still has an infinite past, but the activation times are different with messenger number 1 being first. For reasons I explained in vlog episode 18, it wasn't the best idea to cram the rest of the messengers in 1 hour, but we can fix that by assigning their activation times this way instead, so that we don't need to assume that time is infinitely divisible within a finite time span. Note that when the messenger activation times are constructed in ascending order this way, the second additional requirement becomes relevant, in which case the first messenger writes down the number 1, and the remaining messengers pass that number along. Whether we use Cameron's version or my revised version, a key point is that the only difference between the benign messenger scenario and the Grim Messenger scenarios is the activation times for the messengers. Intuitively then, it seems that if the benign messenger scenario were possible, the Grim Messenger scenario would also be possible, since again, all that's changed between the two scenarios is the alarm clock activation times. Bertuzzi employs this argument. If causal finitism is false, then the benign messenger scenario is possible. If the benign messenger scenario is possible, then the Grim Messenger scenario is possible. The Grim Messenger scenario is impossible. Therefore, causal finitism is true. Bertuzzi uses this recombination principle to justify premise 18, and while this might help, I honestly don't think it's that necessary. For me at least, once you point out that the activation times are the only difference, it seems intuitive enough that if the benign messenger scenario were possible, then the Grim Messenger scenario would also be possible. I think premise 18 is very reasonable. Premise 19 is actually undeniable, at least with the requisite modifications, And so that leaves premise 17. As I mentioned in vlog episode 18, I do think that if we grant the antecedent of 17, that is, if we assume that causal finitism is false, it seems very likely that an infinite past is metaphysically possible, since, by my lights, an infinite past is the most plausible way to instantiate an infinite causal history, particularly in light of the Grim Reaper paradox. The consequent feature is not just an infinite past, but also benign messengers. Intuitively, it seems to me that benign messengers would also be possible if an infinite past were possible, but I think the video's justification for this part is somewhat weak. So all things considered, I think legitimate objections could be made against Bertuzzi's arguments here. There were legitimate flaws, much of which is on me because I didn't spot them at the time when I was one of the people reviewing his statements. But this argument, at least with certain modifications, I think has some real merit. Given the modifications I mentioned, I would find premises 18 and 19 to be quite compelling. Premise 17 is a little weak but fairly plausible by my lights. Bertuzzi's defense of premise 2 involved trying to find a relevant difference between the caused and the uncaused. We know that trees, phones, and stars aren't the sort of things that can be uncaused, along with many other things. So what's the relevant difference between those sorts of things that are caused and something that's uncaused?
My proposal, and this is where we're going to start to see the connection to God, is that the relevant difference between the caused and the uncaused is limits. Part of the reason why we think that rocks and branches and people and cars and mountains have causes is because they're limited in various ways. In general, limits have causes. There's a reason why my computer right here has a 2 terabyte hard drive instead of a 4 terabyte hard drive. There's a reason that I have the limited amount of power that I have. For example, I haven't been to the gym in a while. Limits, or things that possess limits, have causes. Alternatively, let's think about something that has no limits. Some atheists will say that an eternal universe doesn't need a cause. An eternal universe has no limit in time. It never began to exist. Removing a limit, in this case, removes the need for a causal explanation of that limit. An infinite universe doesn't need an explanation, so say many atheists. Now, for the record, I don't think that an eternal universe, just in virtue of being eternal, is completely unlimited. It still would seem to have limits in value and in power and maybe even in size and some other different areas. But the point is that a lot of atheists seem to recognize that limits are a relevant difference between the caused and the uncaused. Now, if in general limits have causes, then we have a very powerful reason for thinking that if the first cause has limits, then it has a cause. However, as we saw earlier, the first cause is basically by definition uncaused. Otherwise, it wouldn't be the first cause. If the first cause wasn't the starting point, if it had prior causes, then trivially, it wouldn't be the first cause. But then it follows from this simple argument that the first cause has no limits. All that's left for the support of this argument is to make the connection to God, and we're going to see that in just a second. We've already exposed a very good reason to think that the first cause is unlimited. Now, as a truly, thoroughly unlimited thing, it would have no limits in shape, no limits in size, no limit in power, in knowledge, in goodness, or in value. In other words, an unlimited nature points to a perfect nature, a nature that is supreme, a nature that cannot be improved upon. So in other words, an unlimited nature points to God. So here's a quick summary of my defense of my second premise. Premise 9, if there is a first cause, then it has no limits. And we saw why this is true. Anything that is limited has a cause. So if the first cause is limited, then it has a cause. However, the first cause is uncaused, so it has no limits. Premise 10, if the first cause has no limits, then it is perfect. And the argument for this is that something that is truly unlimited has no limit in power, knowledge, goodness, and value. Something that cannot be improved upon is perfect. Premise 11, if the first cause is perfect, then God exists. Now, this premise is true if by God we mean a perfect being. And so then it follows, if there is a first cause, then God exists, from 9, 10, and 11.
I have an objection.
Welcome back, intelligent atheist. What's your objection?
It seems to me that premise 9 is not adequately justified. Even if the first cause must be unlimited in some way, isn't being eternal enough? An eternal impersonal first cause seems quite conceivable.
Good point, intelligent atheist. In my opinion, this is the biggest weakness of Bertuzzi's case for the kalam cosmological argument here. In philosophy, there's something called the gap problem, which, in this context, is about trying to bridge the gap between a first cause and the God of traditional theism. In this particular case, I don't find the argument to bridge the gap very convincing. By my lights, premise 9 is far too weakly justified here.
I'm surprised we actually agree.
It's important to remember that just because a belief is right, that doesn't mean every argument in favor of that belief will be a good one. It's also important to remember that intelligent, reasonable people can disagree on an issue. Here's my overall assessment of Bertuzzi's opening statement. I think Cameron Bertuzzi's overall kalam cosmological argument case is strong in some ways, but weak in others, and there's room for an intelligent atheist to provide reasonable objections. To be fair to Bertuzzi, some of the weaknesses were largely my fault because I didn't catch some things I should have caught. Part 3. Woodford's opening statement objections. I'm not going to go every objection Woodford made, but I would like to examine 3 objections in Woodford's opening statement.
1. The contradiction in the Grim Reaper paradox is predicated on a beginning, a starting point. But in order to apply the argument to the universe itself, Cameron must be assuming a starting point within an infinite past, which is not possible. There is no beginning in an infinite past, and without a beginning, there is no paradox.
First of all, no, he doesn't have to assume that an infinite past has a starting point. Maybe this objection was intended to attack premise 5, but there's nothing in premise 5 or the justification for it that needed to assume that an infinite past has to have a starting point. Second, it's not quite true that the Grim Reaper paradox specifies a starting point. Since there's no first Grim Reaper, there's no beginning point where Grim Reaper acts. Nor does the paradox assume a starting point in time. For all the paradox cares, Fred and the Grim Reapers existed eternally. So the idea that without a starting point there is no paradox is just wrong, at least in the literal sense. Maybe what he really meant is that the time span in which Grim Reapers act is finite, even if there's no starting point for their activities. Even if this scenario can be described with Fred and the Grim Reapers existing eternally throughout infinite past, with no starting point in time. Which is true, but so what? Well, one could argue that the infinite past wasn't used to create a contradiction, and that the paradox needs to use an infinite past to create a contradiction. Even if that's true, one could easily arrange this. Just say that every year of an infinite past somebody constructs a Grim Reaper. That process throughout an infinite past would create infinitely many Grim Reapers, and the Grim Reapers can then go on their task of killing Fred at paradoxical times. At any rate, this talk about an infinite past is sort of a red herring because causal finitism is not the same thing as denying an infinite past. In fact, denying that the past is infinite is nowhere in the deductive arguments of Cam's opening statement. Moreover, it's pretty easy to modify the Grim Reaper paradox so that the causal chain is spread out over an infinite past. Suppose, as mentioned before, the past is infinite and Fred is eternal. We can space out the Grim Reapers so that Grim Reaper number 1 checks on Fred 1 year ago, Grim Reaper number 2 checks on Fred 2 years ago, and so forth, and a contradiction still ensues, at least if we add these modifications borrowing from the Eternal Society paradox. This video is already getting pretty long, so you could just pause and read it here if you want. All things considered then, the idea that without a starting point there is no paradox is just wrong. Fred and Grim Reapers existing eternally throughout an infinite past wouldn't remove the contradiction. We can use an infinite past to create a contradiction, and it's easy enough to spread out the Grim Reaper events throughout an infinite past to create a contradiction. To be sure, this is not to say that one can't make an objection against a premise that involves pointing out that the Grim Reaper paradox covers only a finite time span. I did it myself in part 2, where I pointed out that one could say that an infinite causal chain can be instantiated within an infinite past, but that time can't be infinitely divisible within a finite time span. If that's true, then premise 5 is false. The impossibility of the Grim Reaper paradox wouldn't imply causal finitism. Even so, the idea that without a starting point there is no paradox is just wrong, and neither premise 5 nor the justification for it needs to assume that an infinite past has a starting point. So this particular objection doesn't work. A better objection was available, be one that is in some ways similar to this objection. Indeed, Woodford more or less gave that better objection earlier in his opening statement.
But another way to avoid the contradiction is if a segment of time is not infinitely divisible. If a segment of time cannot be divided an infinite number of times, then the Reaper assigned to the last segment of the moment of time kills Fred, and thus the contradiction vanishes.
Oddly, he also said this right afterwards, which is a better objection than claiming that Cameron's use of the Grim Reaper paradox somehow must be assuming that an infinite past has a starting point.
This is to say that Cameron needs to produce the contradiction in reference to an infinite past, as opposed to producing a contradiction in reference to a finite past.
Again, even if we ignore that Bertuzzi was arguing for causal finitism and not technically against an infinite past, this is certainly a better objection than the one given here, even if it could use some improvement. For example, why should we believe that an infinite causal history is metaphysically possible with an infinite time span if it's metaphysically impossible without a finite time span? Without at least some explanation, like a finite time span not being infinitely divisible, it seems more ad hoc than it needs to be. At any rate, One of my key points here is that this particular objection doesn't work, even if other objections do work.
And 2, even if causal finitism was true, this would not get us to a singular first cause of the universe. Now, to be fair, Cameron doesn't state that it does. He asserts that there is a first cause, which could just mean at least one first cause. However, throughout the rest of his presentation, he uses the term a first cause as if it's synonymous with the first cause.
The first cause, the first cause, the first cause, the first cause, the first cause.
This doesn't attack the truth or justification of any premise of the arguments. You might think it attacks premise 2, but Cameron didn't argue that causal finitism gets to a singular first cause of the universe. Rather, his justification for premise 2 was entirely different. Instead, his justification for premise 2 is that a first cause has no limits, which means it's perfect, which leads to God existing. Not saying the justification for premise 2 is compelling. I don't find it particularly strong myself. My point is that this justification is not causal finitism gets to a singular first cause of the universe. That just wasn't the justification he used for premise 2. I think you could object to the way Bertuzzi said the phrase the first cause in his opening statement. Maybe Bertuzzi could have clarified better that he was referring to an arbitrarily chosen first cause when he was describing what properties such a cause would have. When I watched the opening statement, the phrase the first cause referring to some arbitrarily chosen first cause was clear to me when Bertuzzi said it in context. But Bertuzzi spelling that out more explicitly probably would have been helpful. Even so, this particular objection does not attack the truth or justification of any premise of the actual argument.
Even if it is the case that certain kinds of large and small denumerable physical infinities are impossible, it does not follow that therefore all kinds of large and small denumerable physical infinities are impossible.
All denumerable infinities have exactly the same size, so it's a bit nonsensical that the phrase large and small is used here. That aside, it may well be the case that just because certain kinds of denumerable physical infinities are impossible, does not follow that all kinds of physical denumerable infinities are impossible. However, this doesn't attack any premise of Bertuzzi's opening statement arguments. Bertuzzi explains this nicely in his first rebuttal.
Now, if you pay close attention to my opening statement, nowhere in it do I argue that all kinds of large and small denumerable physical infinites are impossible. Causal finitism does not rule out the existence of an infinite number of physical things. It only rules out infinite causal series. I mean, maybe there exists an infinite number of causally disconnected universes. Causal finitism doesn't rule that out.
So we have some red herrings here. For example, even if causal finitism is true, this would not get us to a singular first cause of the universe may be true, but that doesn't attack any premise of the actual argument. And it looks like it might have stemmed from an inadvertent straw man of one of the arguments. The third objection is a particularly egregious red herring. One thing to look for when considering objection to a logically valid argument is whether that objection attacks a premise. If someone makes an objection to a logically valid argument, but the objection doesn't attack the truth or justification of any premise of the argument, you might have a red herring. Part 4. Woodford's responses. Remarkably, in Woodford's closing statement, he claimed that all three of those objections did attack a premise of Cameron's arguments. There are a lot of things wrong with Woodford's closing statement, but for this part of the video, my focus is on these three objections.
Let's take the time to unpack this, beginning with my first objection. Within the same sentence of the quote that Cameron just gave, I said the following. But in order to apply the argument to the universe itself, Cameron must be assuming a starting point within an infinite past, which is not possible. There is no beginning in an infinite past, and without a beginning there is no paradox. Indeed, in the Grim Reaper paradox, we select a beginning and an end of a segment of time, such as between 12 and 1, and then divide the segment an infinite number of times, assigning a Reaper to each point of division. So, if we suppose for a moment that the scenario demonstrates that it's impossible to have an infinite causal chain within a finite segment of time, a time that explicitly has a beginning and an end for us to divide, does it follow that it's impossible to have an infinite causal chain spread across an infinite extent of time, a time that does not have a beginning? Well, I argued that it doesn't. Thus my saying, Cameron needs to produce the contradiction in reference to an infinite past, as opposed to producing a contradiction in reference to a finite past. This, then, is obviously an objection to premise 5. The Grim Reaper scenario could be impossible without causal finitism being true. It could be the case that we can't have infinite causal chains within a finite segment of time, but it doesn't follow that we can't have an infinite causal chain spread out over an infinite extent of time.
Notice this isn't quite the same objection he gave originally. His original primary first objection was this.
1. The contradiction in the Grim Reaper paradox is predicated on a beginning, a starting point. But in order to apply the argument to the universe itself, Cameron must be assuming a starting point within an infinite past.
And that was flawed for reasons I explained earlier. There's nothing in premise 5 or the justification for it that needed to assume that an infinite past has to have a starting point. He did later say this.
This is to say that Cameron needs to produce the contradiction in reference to an infinite past, as opposed to producing a contradiction in reference to a finite past.
But again, that's not the same claim as Cameron Bertuzzi's Grim Reaper paradox somehow must assume that an infinite past has a starting point. Those are two different objections. His different objection is that just because it's impossible to have an infinite causal chain within a finite time region, that doesn't mean an infinite causal chain is impossible and spread out over an infinite temporal region. Again, note that this isn't the same objection as before. It's not quite the same objection as, in order to apply the argument to the universe itself, Cameron must be assuming a starting point within an infinite past. So this is a bit of a Motte and Bailey. At any rate, this new objection more relevantly attacks premise 5, but to some degree it's mistaken. As I mentioned earlier, it's easy enough to modify the Grim Reaper paradox so that the Grim Reapers are spread out throughout the infinite past. And when you look back to the original objection, note that spreading out the Grim Reapers this way doesn't result in a starting point with an infinite past. There is still no first Grim Reaper, whereas Woodford's original objection claimed that in order to apply the argument to the universe itself, Cameron must be assuming a starting point within an infinite past. Notice again that this is a different objection from what was said originally. Just because it's impossible to have an infinite causal chain within a finite time region, that doesn't mean an infinite causal chain is impossible and spread out over an infinite temporal region, is not the same thing as, in order to apply the argument to the universe itself, Cameron must be assuming a starting point within an infinite past. Maybe he had that part in the left in mind when he made that objection here on the right, but the two are not the same objection.
Moving on, my second objection, that causal finitism does not imply a single first cause, can be taken two ways. Either one as an objection of the ambiguity of premise 7, or indeed as an objection of Cameron effectively missing a premise to get us from the plural to the singular.
Let's start with the first proposed interpretation of the second objection.
Either one as an objection of the ambiguity of premise 7,
It wasn't all clear that this was an objection to the ambiguity of line 7, in part because 7 isn't that ambiguous. It doesn't say that there is a singular first cause, only that there is a first cause if causal finitism is true. This is made even clearer in the context of what Bertuzzi said.
Premise 7, if causal finitism is true, then there is a first cause. And remember, if every state has a finite causal history, there must be a first cause. So it follows there is a first cause from 6 in premise 7.
Not saying Bertuzzi couldn't have added further clarification and been more explicit. However, notice that saying even if causal finitism is true, this would not get us to a singular first cause of the universe is not nearly the same thing as saying premise 7 is ambiguous. Those are two very different objections. So this interpretation would be a Motte and Bailey. It's as if Woodford's original second objection is assuming that 7 is asserting that there is only one first cause, when that would be a straw man. I strongly suspect that this straw man was why the original objection was put forward in the first place. Moving on to Woodford's second possible interpretation of the second objection.
or indeed as an objection of Cameron effectively missing a premise to get us from the plural to the singular.
These two deductive arguments don't say there is only one first cause. The closest we find to getting a singular first cause is line 3, but we don't have a missing premise to get to that conclusion. We have premise 2. I think the defense of premise 2, the argument from limits, could deliver that impression when one doesn't realize the first cause as a way to refer to an arbitrarily chosen first cause being talked about in premise 9. All things considered, I do think that the defense of premise 2 is imprecisely worded is a reasonable criticism, but again, that's a very different objection from what was originally said here.
And finally, let's consider my third objection by listening to the paragraph I gave shortly after the sentence that Cameron quoted. One cannot argue from the mere fact that one has described an inconsistent scenario involving the occurrence of large and small denurable physical infinities to the conclusion that it is impossible for there to be large and small denurable physical infinities. At the very least, one has to be able to show that the inconsistency arises only because of the presence of large and small denurable physical infinities. This objection, again, was and is targeted at Cameron's fifth premise. It expresses that Cameron must demonstrate that the inconsistency arises only because of the presence of denumerable infinites. After all, the inconsistency could be simply due, for instance, to the paradox consisting of a proposition and a rule that are mutually unsatisfiable. This would mean that the Grim Reaper paradox is impossible without it following that causal finitism is true.
Let's review what the third objection actually was.
Even if it is the case that certain kinds of large and small denurable physical infinities are impossible, it does not follow that therefore all kinds of large and small denurable physical infinities are impossible.
Notice that the originally stated objection, even if it is the case that certain kinds of large and small denurable physical infinities are impossible, does not follow that therefore all kinds of large and small denumerable physical infinities are impossible is not the same thing as Cameron must demonstrate that the inconsistency arises only because of the presence of denumerable infinites. The two are similar but not quite the same. The first is pointing out a non sequitur that, while perhaps true, does nothing to attack premise 5, whereas the second is making a nonsensical demand, since Cameron's argument is not that denumerable infinities are impossible. After all, one could believe in causal infinitism while still believing that other kinds of denumerable infinities are possible. If we rephrase the demand as an objection like, the justification of premise 5 didn't demonstrate that the inconsistency arises only because of the presence of denumerable infinities, this claim, while perhaps true, still doesn't really attack the truth or justification of premise 5. Granted, it's not just the presence of an infinite causal chain that creates a contradiction, but since a sort of would-be killer depicted in the paradox seems possible at a sort of intrinsic level, it intuitively seems that if we could have an infinite causal chain, then we could string together an infinite sequence of such would-be killers. But that leads to a contradiction in the Grim Reaper paradox. Also, these two are similar but not quite identical. The objection doesn't attack the truth or justification of premise 5. Recall that the claim is that physical denumerable infinities are impossible is a claim that nowhere to be found in premise 5. Nor is it found in the defense of premise 5. It may well be the case that just because certain kinds of large and small physical denumerable infinities are impossible, does not follow, therefore, all kinds of large and small denumerable physical infinities are impossible. But this is irrelevant. Neither premise 5 nor the justification of premise 5 was claiming otherwise. Premise 5 was not claiming that all denumerable physical infinities are impossible, just a certain kind of physical infinity, namely an infinite causal history. We also have a beware what someone demands case. Woodford says that Bertuzzi has to demonstrate that the inconsistency of the Grim Reaper paradox arises only because of the presence of denumerable physical infinities. But he doesn't. All he has to do is to show that his premises of his logically valid arguments are true. Neither premise 5 nor the defense of premise 5 was claiming that the presence of denumerable physical infinities is making causal infinitism impossible. Nor does he need to show that all kinds of denumerable physical infinities are impossible to justify premise 5. The claim, after all, is not that all kinds of denumerable physical infinities are impossible. It's that a certain kind of denumerable infinity is impossible, namely, the type that's an infinite backwards causal chain.
So when Cameron says that none of my original 3 objections target any of his premises, he's just wrong. Now, in hindsight, I appreciate that I could have explicitly stated which premise each of my objections are targeting, but to be honest, I think it's really obvious which they're targeting. I mean, did Cameron think I was just talking about irrelevant stuff and that no one was calling me out on it or something?
People may not have been calling him out on it to his face, but I'd see people online make such comments, and it wasn't necessarily obvious which premises he intended to attack. For example, it's not at all obvious that this third objection here was intended to attack premise 5 because it's so wildly off target. To be fair, in retrospect, it should have been suspected that this second objection was based on a straw man of premise 7, but even in that case, it's not really an attack on premise 7, but an attack against the straw man of premise 7. Also, in retrospect, one can see how the first objection might have been intended to be an attack on premise 5, but even then, it should be remembered that just because it's impossible to have an infinite causal chain within a finite time region, that doesn't mean an infinite causal chain is impossible when it's spread out over an infinite temporal region. It's not the same thing as, in order to apply the argument to the universe itself, Cameron must be assuming a starting point within an infinite past. If lead portions of what Woodford had in mind originally, I think it could have been communicated better. Again, he did say something similar in the left part elsewhere, but those two statements do not mean the same thing. And regarding this point,
did Cameron think I was just talking about irrelevant stuff?
Basically, yeah. Talking about irrelevant stuff happens all the time on the internet. Part of what red herring fallacies are is talking about irrelevant stuff. Some of Woodford's objections did appear to be red herrings.
So unlike his previous objections that targeted no premises in my arguments,
you know what? Since Cameron has been reprimanding me in reference to philosophy and precision, etc., let me reply in kind. Cameron, when you get an objection that doesn't seem to immediately target a premise, take the time to reflect on which premise it could be targeting. Further still, recognise that objections don't actually have to target a premise. They could instead target an implicit or suppressed premise, or the fact that throughout an argument a word or term is ambiguous. Anyhow, and again, 2 of my previous objections rather obviously targeted premise 5.
No, they didn't. Let's consider those 3 objections again, starting with the second objection that was presumably not intended to attack premise 5. In retrospect, I think it's true Cameron and myself should have suspected that the second objection was intended to attack premise 7, even though the second objection would be attacking a straw man of premise 7. For some reason, it never occurred to me that Woodford might be interpreting this part of premise 7 as only one first cause, instead of a first cause. Although the second objection may have intended to attack premise 7, that's not what it actually did. At best, it attacks a straw man of premise 7. Regarding the first and third objections, as originally worded, they didn't clearly attack the truth or justification of premise 5, so it was difficult to tell that was indeed what he was trying to do, as opposed to, making a sort of general objection. So what I've seen happen over and over again when dialoguing with people online is that they make a sort of general objection that doesn't attack any premise of a valid argument, and when I ask which specific premise they dispute, they dodge the question. Oftentimes, many people make objections to deductively valid arguments that just don't attack a premise. So when Woodford made these objections, it was not necessarily obvious that this was supposed to attack a premise, as opposed to making a more general objection to the argument. Again, largely because I've seen it happen over and over again, where people make a general objection to a logically valid argument without attacking a specific premise. Woodford suggested that these two objections obviously attack premise 5 when it should be obvious is that they don't attack premise 5. The first objection was a nonsensical demand that didn't attack the truth or justification of premise 5. The justification premise 5 notes that it's not impossible for an individual to check on Fred and kill him if he's alive then. What makes the Grim Reaper paradox impossible is the infinite chain of such killers. A finite sequence of such killers would not generate a contradiction. Thus, an infinite causal chain seems impossible. This carries some plausibility due to the apparently possible intrinsic nature of such a would-be killer. So if an infinite causal chain were possible, it intuitively seems like it would be possible to string together an infinite number of such would-be killers together. The nonsensical demand that we need to assume a starting point within an infinite past doesn't do anything to address this justification. The third objection was even worse, clearly not attacking premise 5, a premise that wasn't at all claiming that all innumerable physical infinities are impossible. So when Woodford suggests that the first and third objections obviously attack premise 5, I'm tempted to reply like this. On this point,
further still, recognise that objections don't actually have to target a premise. They could instead target an implicit or suppressed premise, or the fact that throughout an argument a word or term is ambiguous.
Sort of. You can criticize the ambiguity of your premise, but what about targeting an implicit or suppressed premise without attacking an explicitly stated premise in the argument? Well, that can be very problematic. In a logically valid argument, all you need for the argument to be sound is for the explicit premises to be true. Again, all you need for a valid argument to be sound is to have true explicit premises. So you can't reasonably say that you agree with the explicit premises of a valid argument, but say the argument is unsound because of some false implicit or suppressed premise. That objection wouldn't make any sense. If a valid argument is unsound, you still need a false explicit premise. One could argue that one of the explicitly stated premises contains an implicit assumption that is false, and thereby making the explicit premise false and the argument unsound, but even then you'd be attacking an actual explicit premise of the argument. Otherwise, if you attack an implicit premise and don't say which premise allegedly makes this false claim, probably not going to be that good of an objection when it's unclear which premise supposedly makes that claim you're attacking. When attacking a specific claim made by a valid argument, good objections to specify which premise allegedly makes that claim. Otherwise, it might look like a red herring fallacy. Part 5, Conclusion. Bertuzzi's argument in his opening statement had some legitimate weaknesses, some of which were largely my fault for not catching them as one of the reviewers of his statements. I thought premise 9 was not convincingly justified, for example. Premise 5 was also pretty weak. The Grim Messenger argument, while a step up from his opening statement, could still have worked better with some modifications. Woodford supplied 3 objections that, as they were originally worded, didn't clearly attack any premise of Bertuzzi's arguments. When I initially started writing this script, I honestly thought the Motte and Bailey's were going to be more severe than they ended up being. Going through the 3 objections in order, the first objection was this. The contradiction in the Grim Reaper paradox is predicated on a beginning, a starting point, but in order to apply the argument to the universe itself, Cameron must be assuming a starting point within an infinite past. A potential Motte and Bailey is this. Just because it's impossible to have an infinite causal chain within a finite time region, that doesn't mean an infinite causal chain is impossible when it's spread out over an infinite temporal region. It's not the same thing as, in order to apply the argument to the universe itself, Cameron must be assuming a starting point within an infinite past. I consider this a mild Motte and Bailey at worst, though, because he does say something similar to this part on the left shortly after making the objection on the right, even though they're not the same thing.
Couldn't one say that this part on the left is the reason why Cameron needs to assume a starting point with an infinite past?
One could, and maybe that's what Woodford had in mind, but it wouldn't make any sense. For obvious reasons, to apply to the universe itself, you'd want a beginningless infinite past, not an infinite past with a starting point. If anything, assuming a starting point for an infinite past is the exact opposite of what you need. Moreover, the first objection as originally worded almost seems more like a demand than an objection to the truth or justification of premise 5, as if it's asserting what Cameron must do. Reworded as more of an objection, the contradiction in the Grim Reaper paradox is predicated on beginning, a starting point. However, the universe with an infinite past does not have a starting point. Which is true, but doesn't seem to address the truth or justification in premise 5, largely because the point of the Grim Reaper paradox was not intended to apply directly to a universe with an infinite past. Instead, the Grim Reaper paradox was just supposed to argue for causal finitism. If the Grim Reaper paradox does succeed in arguing for a causal finitism, then we know that the universe has a finite causal history. This is why I say that this different objection works better, which is somewhat similar but not identical to the first objection as originally stated. The first objection as originally stated didn't do so well. The second objection is, even if causal finitism is true, this would not get us to a singular first cause of the universe. This objection as worded here didn't attack the truth or justification of any premise of the argument. It seemed to be attacking a straw man of premise 7. Woodford said the objection could be interpreted as one of two ways. One way is that Bertuzzi was missing a premise that would bring us from the plural to a singular first cause, which, as I hinted at before, is a straw man since there only being one first cause is nowhere in Bertuzzi's actual deductive arguments. The other was attacking the ambiguity of premise 7. But premise 7 as ambiguous is not the same thing as, even if causal finitism is true, this would not get us to a singular first cause of the universe. So that would be a bit of a Motte and Bailey. Ironically, if both of these interpretations of the second objection are legitimate, Woodford's second objection would be itself ambiguous. To be fair to Woodford, I do think the defense of premise 7 was imprecisely worded. The first two objections are relatively mild Motte and Baileys if they qualify at all. First objection may have just been poorly worded, and the second objection Woodford offered had two impossible interpretations, one of which was clearly not what the second objection originally said, but another which was pretty similar to his original objection, even if not quite identical. The third objection was a really bad red herring. It may well be that just because certain kinds of large and small denumerable infinities are impossible, it does not follow that therefore all kinds of large and small denumerable infinities are impossible. That was nowhere in Bertuzzi's actual reasoning, so it doesn't really attack any premise of the argument. Woodford may have intended the objection to attack premise 5 here, but this objection really didn't do anything to attack the truth or justification of premise 5. To be fair to Woodford, it's not as if he was nowhere near coming up with intelligent objections in his opening statement. Recall that one objection one could make against the Grim Reaper argument is that maybe time can't be infinitely divisible within a finite time span. There's a class of objections that we could call the different impossibility objection. The general idea is that an infinite causal history doesn't imply the possibility of a Grim Reaper paradox because a different sort of impossibility, such as that time can't be infinitely divisible within a finite time span, makes the Grim Reaper paradox impossible. Some examples of different impossibilities one could propose are, it's impossible to have infinitely many Grim Reapers, time can't be infinitely divisible within a finite time span, it's impossible to have enough space to contain infinitely many Grim Reapers, though this is basically a version of the first one, and limitations on information transmission for the Grim Reapers to know whether Fred is dead within a certain time interval. Woodford was at least in the ballpark in his video as illustrated here, where he noted that if we had any of these four restrictions, we couldn't get a contradiction in the Grim Reaper paradox, though some of this seems a bit ad hoc. As I pointed to before, it seems a bit ad hoc to say infinite causal history can happen, but not when the time intervals between causal events get arbitrarily close within a finite time span. Similarly, if an infinite past can happen, it seems plausible that an actual infinite number of things is metaphysically possible. For example, each year somebody creates a new object, and to say that an infinite causal history is possible, but you can only have finitely many Grim Reapers seems ad hoc. Finite space needn't matter. We could say the Grim Reapers get progressively thinner, just as the time gaps do, or that the Grim Reapers are like photons and that can overlap in space. With all that said, I'm not a huge fan of the Grim Reaper paradox being directly used like this for causal finitism or finite past, precisely because it does contain some fantastical elements, like Grim Reapers, and infinitely many of them being able to determine whether Fred is alive and being able to kill him in progressively shorter time intervals like this. It's largely why, when arguing against an infinite past, I prefer something like the Eternal Society paradox. Because in that paradox, the thing bringing about the contradiction is just a society with the abilities of ordinary humans in each year of its existence. Much less extravagant than the elements of the Grim Reaper paradox. The different impossibility objection is a lot harder to apply there, because in that case, for reasons I explained in vlog episode 17, what you'd have to deny is that an eternal society with the abilities of ordinary humans in each year of its existence is possible, and as the paper that introduced the Eternal Society paradox said, Surely there is something metaphysically suspicious about an infinite past of an eternal society with the abilities of ordinary humans can actualize the logical contradiction. By my lights, it is more plausible that an infinite past was never possible in the first place. With respect to some of Woodford's three main objections listed here, I think Woodford may have fooled some of his viewers in thinking that he did indeed attack premises of Cameron's arguments, and it's worth noting how he did so. To be clear, I'm not accusing Woodford of deliberately misleading his audience. At the time he made his closing statement, he may have honestly believed that all his original objections did indeed attack Cameron's premises. As I explained in vlog episode 9, motivated reasoning can lead people astray. Again, I'm not accusing Woodford of deliberately misleading his audience, but I do think he did indeed mislead his audience to some degree. With all that said, there are a few lessons I think we can learn from this. First, it's worth noting how an important factor for how red herrings in general can fool people. Many red herrings say something closely related to a topic even though they are relevant. For example, take a look at this third objection again. Even if it is the case that certain kinds of large and small denumerable infinities are impossible, it does not follow that therefore all kinds of large and small denumerable infinities are impossible. Nowhere does Cameron's argument say that because certain kinds of large and small denumerable physical infinities are impossible, therefore all kinds of large and small denumerable physical infinities are impossible. That's nowhere in Cameron's actual reasoning. This objection is a red herring, but note how this is closely related to premise 5, and that premise 5 deals with some type of infinity, even if neither the antecedent nor the consequent is claiming that all kinds of physical infinities are impossible. The consequent is only claiming that a certain type of denumerable infinity is impossible, not that all kinds of denumerable physical infinities are impossible. Second, let's consider the fact that Cameron produced logically valid arguments, such that it's impossible to have true explicit premises and a false conclusion, that certain objections didn't attack any premise of the argument. When a logically valid argument is being critiqued, beware objections that don't attack the truth or justification of any premise in that logically valid argument, because you might be seeing a red herring. Third, watch how one redescribes a position after someone critiques it. Does the redescribed position match the position as it was originally stated? Watching out for this can help one spot Motte and Bailey's. Note how Woodford redescribed some of his objections after the fact, make it look like they did indeed attack premises of Cameron's arguments when that wasn't always exactly the case. Red herrings can hoodwink audiences by saying something closely related to the issue at hand while still being relevant. In this case, Woodford reformulated his objections that were in some ways similar to his original objections, but still different from the objections as originally stated. And that might have hoodwinked people into thinking that was Woodford's actual stated objection all along, even though it wasn't quite the case. So Woodford used the Motte and Bailey rhetorical technique. To reiterate, I'm not accusing Woodford of deliberate dishonesty here. All this may have happened by accident. Nonetheless, I do think Woodford was misleading in his reformulated objections, even if he did so unintentionally. These original objections, as originally stated, didn't quite match reformulated ones, though in some cases they were similar. Well, that about wrap it up. This is Maverick Christian, inviting you to go in peace, serve the Lord, and love logic.
Thanks for watching. If you liked the video, hit the like button. If you want to see more videos, hit subscribe and ring the bell.